Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So guys, I have with me today Gerald Horne. I have been boosting this show for a very long time because I've been eager to have him on my show since the first time I've come across this video. So Mr. Horne, he is on the phone. We were having a little bit of issues trying to get him on video, but nevertheless, he's still with me. He's resilient nonetheless. Professor Horne, welcome to the Soapbox.
Thank you for inviting me.
Very cool. So Professor Horne is Dr. Gerald Horne, Counter-Revolution of the 1776. And just so you guys can see the books themselves, this is right here. Counter-Revolution 1776, and author of Race to the Revolution, the United States and Cuba during Slavery and Jim Crow. This is kind of one of the reasons I wanted to have him on the show, because you gave a mind-blowing reevaluation of the foundings of this country. And let me set up what I mean by this. One of the things that I was blown away when I was watching what's taking place right now in South America is the African Congress has said, we're going to take the land from the white owners because you guys essentially took it from us during colonialization, and we're going to take it back. Now, when you look at the history of South Africa and you start looking at America from that context, it's almost like you're standing outside of yourself looking at it and saying, well, is some of the beginnings of that country similar to the beginnings of this country? Now, you give in your book, the 1776, essentially this counter-revolution of 1776, you call what took place in regards to the American Revolution a counter-revolution by people who wanted to maintain their slaves. Can you explain that for my audience?
Well, to telescope an argument that took over 350 pages to articulate, the short answer to your question is that when George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and those other slave owners revolted against London circa 1776 and led a war that established the nation now known as the United States of America, a motive force for that decision was apprehension that London was moving towards abolition of slavery, as represented in Somerset's case in London in June 1772, where London had indicated that slavery no longer would obtain in England. Likewise, in 1763, there was a so-called Royal Proclamation where London was seeking to restrain the settlers from moving further west, coming into conflict with the Native Americans as they seized their land and cleansed the indigenous population from that territory. That was causing London to expend tremendous amounts of blood and treasure to accomplish that particular goal. However, this did not go down very well, not least with real estate speculator number one, George Washington. So my argument, in short and in sum, is that, as with most revolts against constituted authority, they're generally driven by such issues as money and power. And certainly that was the case for the 1776 revolt, although there are those who would like to suggest that there were abstract notions of liberty and freedom and all the rest that led to that momentous decision. I should also say that just within the last few weeks, I published a new book that complements the 1776 book. It's about the 1600s, and that is to say the preceding century leading up to 1776. And I make a similar argument about the so-called Glorious Revolution in 1688 in England, which has oftentimes been portrayed as, once again, a struggle over abstract principles. But in many ways, it was a struggle by rising merchants to make sure that the king, the monarch, did not have exclusive control over the lucrative African slave trade. And therefore, what happens after 1688 is that the African slave trade is deregulated. The Royal African Company, which had been organized in 1672 under the thumb of the monarch, begins to decline, and freelance merchants enter that trade. And therein, you see the takeoff of the African slave trade. Therein, you see the takeoff of slavery itself, not least in the Americas. And therein, you see the seeds planted that begin to sprout in 1776.
So the thought here is, well, the only reason that I guess my thinking is, you even make the point that many Africans were fighting on the side of the British in that war.
That's right.
It was understood that the Brits were most likely or were inclined to put a demarcation point in regards to how far the United States, or Americans, or not Americans at this point, but people who were in the colonies, could exceed into the United States, in addition to potentially not having slavery. I mean, I'm blown away by that, because like you said, it's not these abstract ideals. We live in our current time. Paul Ryan would get up there and say, I am fighting for justice and freedom, and I'm looking for the freedom of the Americans, which is why I want to get rid of your Social Security and Medicare. Now, that's nonsense, but if you're looking back from 100 years, you say, wow, that guy was a principled guy. That guy was a principled guy who was fighting for these. Yeah, it's nonsense. But we always look back at history we don't look at history with a critical eye in that way. We look at it as George Washington was fighting the fight because of a British oppression, and he was fighting for these American ideals. Nonsense. It was nonsense. I found that to be amazing in your work. And the fact is, I shouldn't have found that to be amazing. And yet, I realized that I, like everybody else, have been somewhat indoctrinated in a certain belief system. And we're stuck with the belief system. Let me ask you this. From the context of the Civil War, so from the context of the United States being formed, not for ideas of freedom and justice and liberty and fighting oppression and everything else, but from the inglorious position of, we want to keep our slave market. We don't like the fact that Britain is going to get rid of slaves. We need to keep our slaves. This is a lucrative market, et cetera, et cetera. How does the Civil War factor into this then? If it's not, does it make sense? How does, looking from this reimagining position, what does the Civil War look like?
Well, I teach, and I was telling my undergraduate students yesterday that they should draw a parallel between Abraham Lincoln, the U.S. president during the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and Lord Dunmore, the last colonial governor of Virginia before he was booted out by George Washington and his comrades. What I mean is that, as noted, there were more Africans fighting on the side of London against George Washington by several orders of magnitude, because they thought that if they fought against their slave owners, meaning George Washington, that made good sense, particularly since Lord Dunmore was offering to free them if they fought alongside the Redcoats. Likewise, if you look at the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which generally frees enslaved Africans in jurisdictions that Lincoln does not control, that is to say in the so-called Confederate States of America, keep in mind that the Lincoln government was not doing very well up until the Emancipation Proclamation. But with that bold move, you see Africans begin to join the Union Army, and that helps to tip the scales against the Confederate States of America, helping to save Lincoln's government.
So it wasn't the happy Negroes, like this idea of the happy Negro, like these, all of us were reunited, all of us were fighting everything else. Nonsense. Those slaves wanted to be free, and they perfectly understood that one side was going to keep them in slavery and the other side wasn't.
Well, exactly. And not only that, but the options were rather limited because, as you know, in the Lincoln Coalition were those who for the longest had believed in freeing the enslaved Africans so they could all be deported. In fact, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was trying to entice the Brazilian government to accept the U.S. Negro population. But the Brazilians said, thank you very much, we have enough Negroes, and so therefore those of us who are black are still in North America speaking English and not in Brazil speaking Portuguese. But there's another Well, there was a powerful movement to have a so-called white man's country. And in fact, one of the ways you can look at Jim Crow, the U.S. apartheid that follows 1865, is an attempt to create that white man's country in a sense. That is to say, to keep the black people out of certain spaces in internal exile. And of course, you just saw that on a micro level in Starbucks in Philadelphia just about 10 days ago. That is to say, to keep black people out of certain spaces. You see that all the time. I see it every time I go into a hotel and I'm stopped and somebody says, may I help you? Which basically means, who are you and why are you here? Basically. Well, it'd probably be an underdeveloped country. Well, that's a very good question. It's a counterfactual question. It forces me to speculate, and so I'll go down that road and
Wait one second.
that.
Wait 1 second. Just because the people couldn't hear me, you could hear me, but the other people couldn't. I'm sorry, my mic was off. I'm switching audio so my audio doesn't intrude. What I asked them was, what does America look like without having slaves? Because H.A. had that argument with the white supremacists, and he kept making this point that this American country, this white country, and everything else. And I'm making this point that what does this country look like without slaves? And can you even say what America is without having all of that free labor for that 200-300 years in this international powerhouse? What does it look like?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer because it forces me to speculate. But we know, for example, that the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., the major buildings that helped to ignite that capital into being were basically built by slave labor. And so you would have to, I guess, have a Euro-American or so-called white American labor force, which then introduces class contradictions between and amongst those defined as white. In fact, you may know that in 1733, as I say in the book, Georgia is started as a colony with no Negroes allowed. That was part of this idea of having a white man's country. But it did not work out very well because a lot of people did not want to work in the fields. That is to say, those defined as white. If they worked in the fields, certainly they were not going to work for free. And that introduces class tensions that supposedly people were trying to escape when they left Europe. And rather quickly, Georgia abandoned the idea of being a so-called all-white colony. And in fact, if you look at the 2010 census, you will see that Georgia has more black people than any other state in the United States of America. So obviously, that experiment did not work out very well.
I love that. I love that. No, I'm just, I love that. I love that because you're right. Like it's a non sequitur to say that. Like it's like you can't say what is the United States without African labor. Those things you can't separate one from the other and still get the United States.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. And free labor is something that, of course, I was in the LA airport just a few weeks ago, and I noticed a sign saying that people should report if they are aware of people being forced to work for free. And that blew my mind because, as I said, I didn't know that in 2018 there were still cases of people being forced to work for free. But then I recalled what happened in Southern California a few years ago when Thai immigrant laborers were basically locked into some sort of clothing factory because they got burned to a crisp once a fire erupted.
Oh, geez.
So there is a tremendous impulse to have free labor because it is so profitable. And when you think about free labor, think of the African slave trade, which was one of the most lucrative enterprises known to humankind. You could invest $1 and get a 1,700% return. That is to say, get $1,700 back. And there are those who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit, let alone some African person who they did not know. So it's difficult to conceive of the United States of America without conceiving of slavery. And likewise, if you want to understand these very disturbing statistics, everything concerning, for example, the police killings such as Stephon Clark in Sacramento and Eric Garner in New York, or the fact that black kids are more likely to be suspended from school, or black mothers have a higher infant mortality rate in terms of trying to get birth by several orders of magnitude, even if class is held constant with regard to black and white women. I don't think you can begin to understand any of these disturbing realities, not only without an understanding of slavery, but then the second part gets us back to the Civil War, which is that the slave owners' property in enslaved Africans was taken without compensation. And when I tell my students that, they're usually fiddling with their smartphones, trying to ignore what I'm saying, and not snatch the smartphone out of their hands and say, I've just confiscated your property without compensation. I'm sure that does not make you very happy, does it? Well, now you know how certain slave owners felt in 1865, and which helps to generate fury and anger against their former property, because when they see these Negroes walking around, they see basically confiscated fortunes. They see a form of wealth. Not only that, but they see people who they did not consider to be part of the human family now elevated supposedly to the point of being equal.
That's
it would be as if you were eating a turkey sandwich this evening, and then tomorrow there's a decree that says that you can't eat turkey sandwiches anymore because they're part of the human family. I mean, it's that kind of abrupt transition that took place in 1865 and helps to account for many of the problems we're facing in 2018.
I want to step into that for the moment. I'm sorry for interrupting. I'm bad at it. I'm trying to stop it. My audience will chastise me for it. But what you just said there is, again, mind-blowing. Like, you say mind-blowing stuff and move on. It's like, I want to put pins in those things that you're saying. Ultimately, the Civil War, look through the context of us looking back on it. We look at it and say, well, you know, they were slaves, those slaves were freed, et cetera, et cetera. That's the narrative that's pushed. But you're showing this other narrative from the perspective of the owners who's saying, you took away my slaves. That was my property that you took away from me. I don't care if that person was a human being. That's my property. Like, you're looking at it from the context of somebody who owns something as opposed to the context of being freed. I love that. That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating.
Well, sure. And that's why, as I said in my book on Cuba, which you mentioned in your introductory remarks, that after the U.S. Civil War, many of the U.S. slave owners fled to Cuba because slavery continued to exist in Cuba. In fact, and oftentimes they took their property with them. And so there's the possibility that there are those in Virginia who have relatives in Cuba who they don't even know about, perhaps even that look just like them. Likewise, I wrote a book on Brazil, and I pointed out that many of these slave owners fled to Brazil as well, where slavery existed until 1888. And in fact, you have these confederados, as they're called. There's a picture of former U.S. President Jimmy Carter visiting Brazil and visiting the graveyard where some of his descendants were buried, because they were amongst those who fled to Brazil after 1865, precisely because they did not want to give up their valuable property. An enslaved African could cost thousands of dollars, particularly if they were skilled. And in that particular moment in time, in the 1860s, thousands of dollars, that was real money. Actually, some might even consider it to be real money today.
That's amazing. Like, I don't think most people know that. Like, when part of the reason I wanted you on the show is because when people look at American history and they think back, we think all countries have their iconography. Like, all countries have these things that they hold prize. You know, I'm pretty sure Turkey has their belief system and those things. I'm pretty sure Iran, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's hard to pull yourself out of it and see it from a different perspective. Not necessarily the propaganda that you were necessarily told, but a different perspective of events. Like, this is a mind-blowing to get across this idea that the American Revolution wasn't really a revolution. It was a counter-revolution for people trying to have this inglorious thing of maintaining their slaves, and that the Civil War was this kind of expansion of that. And would you agree with that? The Civil War, looked within this context, is somewhat of an expansion of kind of, I guess, this ideological battle that was taking place from the standpoint of the Civil War. And ideological might be too strong. This capitalistic instinct of, how do I preserve my profits? How do I preserve my profits?
Well, yes. The difference being, of course, is that in 1865, the slave owners were defeated. In 1776, they won. Likewise, if you look at Texas, I'm speaking to you from the state of Texas, and there's a lot of mythology around Texas, too.
Yeah.
But those who've studied this question more carefully, and you could look at my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, to get an example of what I'm speaking. In 1836, Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston et al., they seceded from Mexico, not least because in the 1820s, Mexico, under a president of partial African descent, Vicente Guerrero, 180 years before the election of Barack Hussein Obama in the United States in 2008, had led a movement successfully to abolish slavery. Austin, Houston et al. Were not sympathetic to that maneuver, and so they seceded from Mexico. And, of course, as I point out, they were under tremendous pressure, not least from abolitionist Britain and revolutionary Haiti, to abolish slavery. So finally, in 1845, Texas put its tail between its legs and slunk into the United States of America, where it still remains. That is to say, it's joined the United States as a slave-owning territory. Although since that time, there have been stirrings about another secession by Texas from the United States of America. But in any case, I don't think you can begin to understand the history of slavery without understanding this tremendous impulse towards secession, which is basically founded on the principle of maintaining this free labor because it is so lucrative, because it is so profitable.
Yeah. I mean, if you can get somebody to work for you for free or cheap, imagine what you can do and produce when you don't necessarily have to pay for the labor that you're getting for it. Yeah, I agree. Let me ask you this. Let's move a little bit further in time, and let's get to the Trump phenomena. Why did Donald Trump get elected in the United States? I'm leaving that question open and expansive because you have a particular context, meaning this kind of historical context of events. Why did Donald Trump get elected? Why did the United States elect a reality show host for president?
Well, it's a complicated story. I mean, there was just an article in the New York Times that tried to dismiss the idea that economic anxiety caused those defined as white to vote for Donald J. Trump. As you know, the black community voted against Donald J. Trump 9-1.
90%.
And he only
90%. I want to step into that too, but oh man, I definitely want to step into that part because I think we may have a slight difference of opinion on that on the Democratic Party, but the Trump thing first.
Oh, sure. I mean, you know, it's like 1776. I mean, London was a slave-owning power. It was offering freedom, but oftentimes history does not present very clear-cut options. Yeah. And you take the least bad option. I can't tell you how many times I've written the phrase least bad in terms of all the books that I've written. Because that's basically what things come down to. You take the least bad option as opposed to the worst option. But in any case, getting back to Trump, I think that in order to understand the Trump phenomenon, you have to understand the preceding epoch, that is to say the Cold War with the United States and Soviet Union. The United States felt that in order to fight the Cold War more effectively, there had to be an attack on class-based organizations, particularly unions. And this was happening at the same time as Jim Crow was under attack in the United States. I'm speaking about the 1950s, for example, with the rise of the Martin Luther King-led movement. And so what happens is that there is this perception that the elite, that the United States, they care more about black people because black people had this anti-Jim Crow movement. Jim Crow was a black eye for the United States. It was under tremendous pressure to get rid of Jim Crow because the United States was trying to appeal to countries in Africa and the Caribbean that were surging to independence and found it difficult to do so as long as there was apartheid in this country. So that leads to these anti-Jim Crow concessions at the same time that unions are being hamstrung. And that helps to confuse a goodly number, shall we say, of our white working class brothers and sisters. And Donald Trump comes along.
Put a pin in that. Wait, God, you have to put a pin in that. Like you say magnificent things. You're making this connection between what's taking place outside of the world, meaning United States, for international politics, what they want to accomplish outside of the world, especially for other African nations fighting this kind of Cold War and believing that they need to appeal to these certain African nations in order to prevent them from kind of going in line with the Soviet Union, while simultaneously, as they're attacking the Soviet Union, attacking unions and having whites to say, well, to get confused by these things and to Oh God, that's awesome. I'm sorry. Go ahead, continue. I just wanted to put a pin in that. Like
But
that's an amazing
and
correlation.
I should also say that the attack on unions was not a boon for black people either,
No, it
because
wasn't.
the black community is mostly working class, and so as the saying goes, we were getting the right to eat at a restaurant, but not having the money to pay the bill. Because real wages were going down, particularly with the advent of Reagan in 1980. So then comes 2016, and there had just been the Barack Obama phenomenon, a black president. The newspapers are full of stories about the United States becoming a majority-minority country. And as the New York Times article today says, that helps to contribute to a certain kind of status anxiety amongst many defined as white. They feel that they're losing their country. They say they want their country back. And Mr. Trump is saying he can make America great again. And all of this comes together. And then, of course, there's a woman leading the Democratic Party ticket, a woman leading the Green Party ticket. And that was also helping to signify a certain level of change that many people found unsettling, particularly after having a black president. And so in some ways, the Donald J. Trump phenomenon was an attempt to turn back the clock. And we'll see if that works.
Is it fair to say in one context, it's an attempt to turn back the clock? In another context, it's... The saddest thing is always interesting to me, because ultimately they're not losing anything. What they consider to be losing is this differential between where they were versus where they are. Like this thing of if whites were at number 10 and then blacks were at 5, blacks moving up to 8, they feel like they've lost something. Well, they've lost something from this positional standpoint, but they haven't necessarily lost something in disposition. I would say you can go to any black person and have that conversation, and they would tell you whites have lost nothing in this process. Now, the other part to that, though, is economic anxieties. Now, you'd agree with me that during times where there was economic stress, that number of slave killings went up, or the people would go out and that like you would find an increase in racial crime and racial disparities when there were these kind of economic problems going throughout the society. Is that fair? Is that true?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's just like when Obama was elected, the number of gun sales went up.
Yes.
With Trump getting elected, people have less fear of confiscating weapons, and so you've seen Remington and other gun manufacturers go bankrupt. So yeah, I think there's something to what you're saying.
So let me ask you this: so the lesser evil, I've made an argument. I call it the no argument. What I mean by that is the lesser evil argument ends up in the situation where you are perpetually in this kind of Chinese finger trap, where you're always perpetually getting less. So it's almost like somebody said one concentration camp less. It's like, do you really want to vote for one concentration camp less? Yes, technically it's better if you're looking at it from a mathematical point, but do you really want to vote for concentration camps at all? And is there a certain point where you just say no because you don't necessarily want to allow to cede any more ground, realizing that the situation that you found yourself is a no-win situation? And what I mean by that is having this thing where Democrats have said, okay, we've taken this Faustian bargain where we're going to essentially not actually be Democrats. We're not going to live up to a philosophical responsibility, and we're going to give least worse. Because we always know that we can make an argument for least worse and get people to vote for us in least worse. And I kind of make the point that that's a game. That's a trick. That's somewhat of a gimmick that allows them to kind of scam votes while actually representing the interests of the top 1%. Will I be false on that, or am I lacking a contextual point of view of me making that case?
No, I think there's something to what you're saying. I mean, just in the interest of full disclosure, I ran for the U.S. Senate from the state of California on a third-party ticket.
Oh, nice.
So I'm certainly sympathetic to third parties. Yeah. But stepping back from 30,000 feet and not looking at my own subjective viewpoints and trying to understand those who vote for the Democrats, I'm trying to understand their thinking so that I can present an explanation for their thinking. And given the fact that in Dixie, Mississippi, 9 out of 10 of those defined as white vote for the GOP and have done so for decades now.
90%. Wow.
And Alabama, too. So it doesn't leave too many options if you're looking for some sort of progress. And so I understand those who feel that they have no choice but to take the least bad route. Although, as I said, in my own life, I ran as a third-party candidate, And I must say, to put it euphemistically, in that race, I got a bronze medal. The euphemism is that I came in third.
So let me ask you this then. Let's be optimistic for the moment. Is there a path to change what? Look, I think the idea that the Democratic Party is putting Hillary Clinton up for president is you're essentially putting a Republican up that's a neocon, and you're saying that this woman is running for the Democratic Party. Is there a path of change? And is there a way of getting out what I would consider to be this kind of trap of sorts, as opposed to the way the system is set up now, if that makes sense?
Well, I would point to three factors: education, organization, and internationalization. Education, we need more mass education on all sorts of levels, particularly amongst those who are hungry for change. Organization of unions at the workplace, student unions to resist tuition increases, renters unions to resist rent increases, and tenants unions to resist gentrification. And we need internationalization. That is to say, because there are so many hostile forces here in the United States of America, that historically the way we've been able to turn the tables on those hostile forces is by organizing beyond the borders of the United States of America. That's what we've really lost. And until we can revive that three-pronged approach, education, organization, internationalization, I dare say that we will perpetually be stuck with buffoons full of bluster, like the Agent Orange that now occupies the highest office in the land, speaking of the 45th president of the United States of America.
That's terrifying. That's terrifying, because I don't see any of those things taking place. And not just not seeing any of those things take place. Like, what you're describing are antagonisms built into the system itself. Like the system itself essentially having these conflicts. Like, for example, I don't want a boss. Like, I don't want there to be a boss. If you can have... You can make an argument that there's always to some degree a boss, but I think there's a difference in this idea of creating a system that creates elites. The systemic thing where there's somebody else who's getting a top 1% and everybody else. That needs to be broken, man. And it's just sad. That's all. It's sad. It's like I don't see an outlet. The one last question, because I thank you very much for coming on. Is there anything that you would like to tell the audience that I haven't asked you? I always ask this because there's sometimes that there may be something that the person wants to say or the person wants to get across that haven't been asked.
Well, not really. I mean, thank you for inviting me, and I would just tell your audience to put my name into a search engine. I've written a number of books, dozens of books, in fact, on many different topics: film industry, slavery, 20th century radicalism, international affairs. So, check it out. Horne, Gerald, Gerald.
Well, I put you in the bottom so they can definitely see you. And like I said, somebody mentioned your name, and I did a search, and I found you on Real News Network. And I was like, I know this guy. I've seen this guy. And as I started kind of digging through more and more of your content, I was like, oh my God, I need to see if I can get this guy on the show. This guy's amazing. Thank you very much, Gerald Horne, Professor Gerald Horne. I'm putting all his... at the very least, the top two books that I knew of in the bottom, so people can see it for themselves. So thank you very much for coming on to the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Very cool. All right, guys,
Bye-bye.
I'm going to end this here. I hope you guys enjoy that. I'm fascinated by this. Like, there were multiple parts where I'm like, wait, put a pin in that, because fascinating. Like, that's not the perspective that you get. And for the moment, step back from it and look at it from the standpoint of the way we look at news now. We're extremely cynical of what these guys say and the narratives that these guys promote. And so you kind of have to look at it also with a particular historical context in the same way. They're political actors. Well, they were political actors with amazing narratives that were able to propagate through history. So Wesley Walker, great show, Jamal. Thank you, Wesley. I appreciate it. Well, that's more goes to Gerald because it's fucking amazing. So, all right, I'm going to end this here. You guys have a good, decent night. I may do more shows. I'm not sure. They're tired, so I may not. If I don't, you guys will see me bright and early in the morning. But I gotta be honest, you probably will see me in 20 minutes. So, all right, guys. If you enjoyed the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you guys can always support through Patreon. Big shout out and thank you very much to Gerald Horne, Dr. Gerald Horne. I want to add the doctor in because he was amazing. You guys have a good one.